Kovrin turns away from the black monk, who finds a singular sort of vengeance. Anton Chekhov, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. How would you like to give the gift of the entire Classic Tales Audiobooks library this holiday season to everyone you'd like? Your whole list of clients, employees, students, grandkids, all of them can have access to everything. For a limited time, if you go to classictalesaudiobooks.com, you can buy a Giftable all-access library pass. It's a 5-month subscription that will grant unlimited free access to our entire library of titles that you can give to anyone you want. You buy the product, we give you a coupon code and a link that you can email to your friends, employees, clients, family, the whole list. The web page will walk them through the process of setting up a free account, and they can download whatever they want for 5 months. If you want to keep going, you can. Think of it. All of your employees, your friends, your family, your clients, discovering the Count of Monte Cristo, David Copperfield, Arsène Lupin Boxed Sets, P.G. Wodehouse, Agatha Christie, Scaramouche. So many amazing audiobooks for all your friends to discover and enjoy. You'll have so much to talk about. They will love it. Go now to classictalesaudiobooks.com and get the Giftable All-Access Library Pass. Give the unlimited gift of literature to everyone this holiday season. This is a limited time offer. Don't miss it. And now, The Black Monk, Part 2 of 2 by Anton Chekhov. Six. Learning from Kovrin that not only a romance had been got up, but that there would even be a wedding, Yegor Semyonich spent a long time in pacing from one corner of the room to the other, trying to conceal his agitation. His hands began trembling. His neck swelled and turned purple. He ordered his racing droshky and drove off somewhere. Tanya, seeing how he lashed the horse, and seeing how he pulled his cap over his ears, understood what he was feeling, shut herself up in her room, and cried the whole day. In the hothouses, the peaches and plums were already ripe. The packing and sending off of these tender and fragile goods to Moscow took a great deal of care, work, and trouble. Owing to the fact that the summer was very hot and dry, it was necessary to water every tree, and a great deal of time and labor was spent on doing it. Numbers of caterpillars made their appearance, which, to Kovrin's disgust, the laborers and even Yegor Semyonich and Tanya squashed with their fingers. In spite of all that, they had already to book autumn orders for fruit and trees, and to carry on a great deal of correspondence. And at the very busiest time, when no one seemed to have a free moment, the work of the fields carried off more than half their laborers from the garden. Yegor Semyonich, sunburnt, exhausted, ill-humored, galloped from the fields to the garden and back again, cried that he was being torn to pieces, and that he should put a bullet through his brains. Then came the fuss and worry of the trousseau, to which the Pesotskys attached a good deal of importance. Everyone's head was in a whirl from the snipping of the scissors, the rattle of the sewing machine, the smell of hot irons, and the caprices of the dressmaker, a huffy and nervous lady. And, as ill luck would have it, visitors came every day, who had to be entertained, fed, and even put up for the night. But all this hard labor passed unnoticed as though in a fog. Tanya felt that love and happiness had taken her unawares, though she had, since she was 14 for some reason, been convinced that Kovrin would marry her and no one else. She was bewildered, could not grasp it, could not believe herself. At one minute, such joy would swoop down upon her that she longed to fly away to the clouds and there pray to God. At another moment, she would remember that in August she would have to part from her home and leave her father, or, goodness knows why, the idea would occur to her that she was worthless, insignificant, and unworthy of a great man like Kovrin. And she would go to her room, lock herself in, and cry bitterly for several hours. When there were visitors, she would suddenly fancy that Kovrin looked extraordinarily handsome, and that all the women were in love with him and envying her, and her soul was filled with pride and rapture, as though she had vanquished the whole world. But he had only to smile politely at any young lady for her to be trembling with jealousy, to retreat to her room, and tears again. These new sensations mastered her completely. She helped her father mechanically, without noticing peaches, caterpillars, or laborers, or how rapidly the time was passing. It was almost the same with Yegor Semyonich. He worked from morning till night, was always in a hurry, was irritable, and flew into rages. But all of this was in a sort of spellbound dream. It seemed as though there were two men in him. One was the real Yegor Semyonich, who was moved to indignation and clutched his head in despair when he heard of some irregularity from Ivan Karlovich, the gardener. And another, not the real one, who seemed as though he were half drunk, would interrupt a business conversation at half a word, touch the gardener on the shoulder, and begin muttering, "Say what you like, there is a great deal in blood. His mother was a wonderful woman, most high-minded and intelligent. It was a pleasure to look at her good, candid, pure face. It was like the face of an angel. She drew splendidly, wrote verses, spoke 5 foreign languages, sang. Poor thing, she died of consumption. The kingdom of heaven be hers." The unreal Yegor Semyonich sighed, and after a pause, went on. "When he was a boy, and growing up in my house, he had the same angelic face, good and candid. The way he looks and talks and moves is as soft and elegant as his mother's. And his intellect! We were always struck with his intelligence. To be sure, it's not for nothing he's a master of arts. It's not for nothing. And wait a bit, Ivan Karlovich. What will he be in 10 years' time? He will be far above us." But at this point the real Yegor Semyonich, suddenly coming to himself, would make a terrible face, would clutch his head and cry, "The devils! They have spoilt everything! They have ruined everything! They have spoilt everything! The garden's done for! The garden's ruined!" Kovrin, meanwhile, worked with the same ardor as before, and did not notice the general commotion. Love only added fuel to the flames. After every talk with Tanya, he went to his room, happy and triumphant, took up his book or his manuscript with the same passion with which he had just kissed Tanya and told her of his love. What the black monk had told him of the chosen of God, of eternal truth, of the brilliant future of mankind and so on, gave peculiar and extraordinary significance to his work, and filled his soul with pride and the consciousness of his own exalted consequence. Once or twice a week, in the park or in the house, he met the black monk and had long conversations with him. But this did not alarm him, but on the contrary, delighted him, and he was now firmly persuaded that such apparitions only visited the elect few who rise up above their fellows and devote themselves to the service of the idea. One day the black monk appeared at dinner-time and sat in the dining-room window. Kovrin was delighted, and very adroitly began a conversation with Yegor Semyonich and Tanya of what might be of interest to the monk. The black-robed visitor listened and nodded his head graciously, and Yegor Semyonich and Tanya listened too, and smiled gaily, without suspecting that Kovrin was not talking to them, but to his hallucination. Imperceptibly, the fast of the Assumption was approaching, and soon after came the wedding, which, at Yegor Semyonich's urgent desire, was celebrated with a flourish, that is, with senseless festivities that lasted for 2 whole days and nights, 3,000 rubles worth of food and drink was consumed. But the music of the wretched hired band, the noisy toasts, the scurrying to and fro of the footmen, the uproar and crowding, prevented them from appreciating the taste of the expensive wines and wonderful delicacies ordered from Moscow. 7. One long winter night, Kovrin was lying in bed, reading a French novel. Poor Tanya, who had headaches in the evenings from living in town, to which she was not accustomed, had been asleep a long while, and from time to time articulated some incoherent phrase in her restless dreams. It struck 3 o'clock. Kovrin put out the light and lay down to sleep. Lay for a long time with his eyes closed, but could not get to sleep because, as he fancied, the room was very hot, and Tanya talked in her sleep. At 4:30, he lighted the candle again, and this time he saw the black monk sitting in an armchair near the bed. "Good morning," said the monk, and after a brief pause, he asked, "What are you thinking of now?" "Of fame," answered Kovrin. "In the French novel I have just been reading, there is a description of a young savant who does silly things and pines away through worrying about fame. I can't understand such anxiety." "Because you are wise. Your attitude towards fame is one of indifference, as towards a toy which no longer interests you." "Yes, that is true." "Renown does not allure you now. What is there flattering, amusing, or edifying in their carving your name on a tombstone, then time rubbing off the inscription together with the gilding? Moreover, happily there are too many of you for the weak memory of mankind to be able to retain your names." "Of course," assented Kovrin. "Besides, why should they be remembered? But let us talk of something else. Of happiness, for instance. What is happiness?" When the clock struck 5, he was sitting on the bed, dangling his feet to the carpet, talking to the monk. In ancient times, a happy man grew at last frightened of his happiness. It was so great, and to propitiate the gods, he brought as a sacrifice his favorite ring. Do you know that I, too, like Polycrates, begin to be uneasy of my happiness? It seems strange to me that from morning to night I feel nothing but joy. It fills my whole being and smothers all other feelings. I don't know what sadness, grief, or boredom is. Here I am, not asleep. I suffer from sleeplessness, but I am not dull. I say it in earnest. I begin to feel perplexed." "But why?" the monk asked in wonder. "Is joy a supernatural feeling? Ought it not to be the normal state of man? The more highly a man is developed on the intellectual and moral side, the more independent he is, the more pleasure life gives him. Socrates, Diogenes, and Marcus Aurelius were joyful, not sorrowful. And the apostle tells us, 'Rejoice continually. Rejoice and be glad.'" "But will the gods be suddenly wrathful?" Kovrin jested, and he laughed. "If they take from me comfort and make me go cold and hungry, it won't be very much to my taste." Meanwhile, Tanya woke up and looked with amazement and horror at her husband. He was talking, addressing the armchair, laughing and gesticulating. His eyes were gleaming, and there was something strange in his laugh. "Andryusha, whom are you talking to?" she asked, clutching the hand he stretched out to the monk. "Andryusha, whom?" "Oh, whom?" said Kovrin in confusion. "Why, to him. He is sitting here," he said, pointing to the black monk. "There is no one here. No one! Andryusha, you are ill!" Tanya put her arm round her husband and held him tight, as though protecting him from the apparition, and put her hand over his eyes. "You are ill," she sobbed, trembling all over. "Forgive me, my precious, my dear one, but I have noticed for a long time that your mind is clouded in some way. You are mentally ill, Andryusha." Her trembling infected him too. He glanced once more at the armchair, which was now empty, felt a sudden weakness in his arms and legs, was frightened, and began dressing. "It's nothing, Tanya, it's nothing," he muttered, shivering. "I really am not quite well. It's time to admit that. I have noticed it for a long time, and Father has noticed it," she said, trying to suppress her sobs. "You talk to yourself, smile somehow strangely, and can't sleep. Oh, my God, save us!" she said in terror. "But don't be frightened, Andryusha. For God's sake, don't be frightened." She began dressing too. Only now, looking at her, Kovrin realized the danger of his position, realized the meaning of the black monk and his conversations with him. It was clear to him now that he was mad. Neither of them knew why they dressed and went into the dining room, she in front and he following her. There they found Yegor Semyonich, standing in his dressing gown, with a candle in his hand. He was staying with them, and had been awakened by Tanya's sobs. "Don't be frightened, Andryusha," Tanya was saying, shivering as though in a fever. "Don't be frightened. Father, it will all pass over. It will all pass over." Kovrin was too much agitated to speak. He wanted to say to his father-in-law in a playful tone, "Congratulate me. It appears I have gone out of my mind." But he could only move his lips and smile bitterly. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they put on his jacket and fur coat, wrapped him up in a shawl, and took him in a carriage to a doctor. 8. Summer had come again, and the doctor advised their going into the country. Kovrin had recovered. He had left off seeing the black monk, and he had only to get up his strength. Staying at his father-in-law's, he drank a great deal of milk, worked for only 2 hours out of the 24, and neither smoked nor drank wine. On the evening before Elijah's day, they had an evening service in the house. When the deacon was handing the priest the censer, the immense old room smelt like a graveyard, and Kovrin felt bored. He went out into the garden. Without noticing the gorgeous flowers, he walked about the garden, sat down on a seat, then strolled about the park. Reaching the river, he went down and then stood lost in thought, looking at the water. The sullen pines with their shaggy roots, which had seen him a year before so young, so joyful and confident, were not whispering now, but standing mute and motionless, as though they did not recognize him. And indeed, his head was closely cropped, his beautiful long hair was gone, his step was lagging, his face was fuller and paler than last summer. He crossed by the footbridge to the other side, where the year before there had been rye, the oats stood, reaped, and lay in rows. The sun had set, and there was a broad stretch of glowing red on the horizon, a sign of windy weather next day. It was still. Looking in the direction from which the year before the black monk had first appeared, Kovrin sat for 20 minutes, till the evening glow had begun to fade. When, listless and dissatisfied, he returned home, the service was over. Yegor Semyonich and Tanya were sitting on the steps of the veranda, drinking tea. They were talking of something, but seeing Kovrin, ceased at once, and he concluded from their faces that their talk had been about him. "I believe it is time for you to have your milk," Tanya said to her husband. "No, it is not time yet," he said, sitting down on the bottom step. "Drink it yourself. I don't want it." Tanya exchanged a troubled glance with her father, and said in a guilty voice, "You notice yourself that milk does you good." "Yes, a great deal of good." Kovrin laughed. "I congratulate you. I have gained a pound in weight since Friday." He pressed his head tightly in his hands and said miserably, "Why? Why have you cured me? Preparations of bromide, idleness, hot baths, supervision, cowardly consternation at every mouthful and every step. All this will reduce me at last to idiocy. I went out of my mind. I had megalomania, but then I was cheerful, confident, and even happy. I was interesting and original. Now I have become more sensible and stolid, but I am like everyone else. I am mediocrity. I am weary of life. Oh, how cruelly you have treated me. I saw hallucinations, but what harm did that do anyone? I ask, what harm did that do anyone?"
"Goodness knows what you are saying," sighed Yegor Semyonich. "It's positively wearisome to listen to it."
"Then don't listen." The presence of other people, especially Yegor Semyonich, irritated Kovrin now. He answered him dryly, coldly, and even rudely, never looked at him but with irony and hatred, while Yegor Semyonich was overcome with confusion and cleared his throat guiltily, though he was not conscious of any fault in himself. At a loss to understand why their charming and affectionate relations had changed so abruptly, Tanya huddled up to her father and looked anxiously in his face. She wanted to understand and could not understand, and all that was clear to her was that their relations were growing worse and worse every day, that of late her father had begun to look much older, and her husband had grown irritable, capricious, quarrelsome, and uninteresting. She could not laugh or sing. At dinner she ate nothing, did not sleep for nights together, expecting something awful, and was so worn out that on one occasion she lay in a dead faint from dinner time till evening. During the service, she thought her father was crying, and now, while the three of them were sitting together on the terrace, she made an effort not to think of it. How fortunate Buddha, Mohammed, and Shakespeare were, that their kind relations and doctors did not cure them of their ecstasy and their inspiration, said Kovrin. If Mohammed had taken bromide for his nerves, had worked only 2 hours out of the 24, and had drunk milk, that remarkable man would have left no more trace after him than his dog. Doctors and kind relations will succeed in stupefying mankind, with making mediocrity pass for genius, and in bringing civilization to ruin. If you only knew, Kovrin said with annoyance, how grateful I am to you. He felt intense irritation, and to avoid saying too much, he got up quickly and went into the house. It was still, and the fragrance of the tobacco plant and the marvel of Peru floated in at the open window. The moonlight lay in green patches on the floor and on the piano in the big dark dining room. Kovrin remembered the raptures of the previous summer, when there had been the same scent of the marvel of Peru, and the moon had shone in at the window. To bring back the mood of last year, he went quickly to his study, lighted the strong cigar, and told the footman to bring him some wine. But the cigar left a bitter and disgusting taste in his mouth, and the wine had not the same flavor as it had the year before. And so great is the effect of giving up a habit, the cigar and the 2 gulps of wine made him giddy, and brought on palpitations of the heart, so that he was obliged to take bromide. Before going to bed, Tanya said to him, "Father adores you. You are cross with him about something, and it is killing him. Look at him. He is aging, not from day to day, but from hour to hour. I entreat you, Andryusha, for God's sake, for the sake of your dead father, for the sake of my peace of mind, Be affectionate to him.
I can't. I don't want to.
But why? Asked Tanya, beginning to tremble all over. Explain why.
Because he is antipathetic to me, that's all, said Kovrin carelessly, and he shrugged his shoulders. But we won't talk about him. He is your father.
I can't understand. I can't, said Tanya, pressing her hands to her temples and staring at a fixed point. Something incomprehensible, awful, is going on in the house. You have changed, grown unlike yourself. You, clever, extraordinary man as you are irritated over trifles, meddle in paltry nonsense. Such trivial things excite you that sometimes one is simply amazed and cannot believe that it is you. Come, don't be angry, she went on, kissing his hands, frightened of her own words. You are clever, kind, noble. You will be just to father. He is so good.
He is not good. He is just good-natured. Burlesque old uncles like your father, with well-fed, good-natured faces, extraordinarily hospitable and queer, at one time used to touch me and amuse me in novels and in farces and in life. Now I dislike them. They are egoists to the marrow of their bones. What disgusts me most of all is their being so well-fed, and that purely bovine, purely hoggish optimism of a full stomach.
Tanya sat down on the bed and laid her head on the pillow. This is torture, she said, and from her voice it was evident that she was utterly exhausted and that it was hard for her to speak. Not one moment of peace since the winter. Why, it's awful. My God, I am wretched.
Of course, I am Herod, and you and your father are the innocents, of course.
His face seemed to Tanya ugly and unpleasant. Hatred and an ironical expression did not suit him. And indeed, she had noticed before that there was something lacking in his face, as though ever since his hair had been cut, his face had changed too. She wanted to say something wounding to him, but immediately she caught herself in this antagonistic feeling. She was frightened and went out of the bedroom. 9. Kovrin received a professorship at the university. The inaugural address was fixed for the 2nd of December, and a notice to that effect was hung up in the corridor at the university. But on the day appointed he informed the student's inspector by telegram that he was prevented by illness from giving the lecture. He had hemorrhaging from the throat. He was often spitting blood, but it happened 2 or 3 times a month that there was a considerable loss of blood, and then he grew extremely weak and sank into a drowsy condition. This illness did not particularly frighten him, as he knew that his mother had lived for 10 years or longer, suffering from the same disease, and the doctors assured him that there was no danger and had only advised him to avoid excitement, to lead a regular life, and to speak as little as possible. In January again, his lecture did not take place, owing to the same reason, and in February it was too late to begin the course. It had to be postponed to the following year. By now he was living not with Tanya, but with another woman, who was 2 years older than he was, and who looked after him as though he were a baby. He was in a calm and tranquil state of mind. He readily gave in to her, and when Varvara Nikolaevna, that was the name of his friend, decided to take him to the Crimea, he agreed, though he had a presentiment that no good would come of the trip. They reached Sevastopol in the evening and stopped at an hotel to rest and go on the next day to Yalta. They were both exhausted by the journey. Varvara Nikolaevna had some tea, went to bed, and was soon asleep. But Kovrin did not go to bed. An hour before starting for the station,
He had received a letter from Tanya, and had not brought himself to open it, and now it was lying in his coat pocket, and the thought of it excited him disagreeably. At the bottom of his heart he genuinely considered now that his marriage to Tanya had been a mistake. He was glad that their separation was final, and the thought of that woman, who in the end had turned into a living relic, still walking about, though everything seemed dead in her except her big, staring, intelligent eyes. The thought of her roused in him nothing but pity and disgust with himself. The handwriting on the envelope reminded him how cruel and unjust he had been 2 years before, how he had worked off his anger at his spiritual emptiness, his boredom, his loneliness, and his dissatisfaction with life by revenging himself on people in no way to blame. He remembered also how he had torn up his dissertation and all the articles he had written during his illness, and how he had thrown them out of window, and the bits of paper had fluttered in the wind and caught on the trees and flowers. In every line of them he saw strange, utterly groundless pretension, shallow defiance, arrogance, megalomania, and they made him feel as though he were reading a description of his vices. And when the last manuscript had been torn up and sent flying out of window, he felt for some reason suddenly bitter and angry. He went to his wife and said a great many unpleasant things to her. My God, how he had tormented her. One day, wanting to cause her pain, he told her that her father had played a very unattractive part in their romance, that he had asked him to marry her. Yegor Semyonitch accidentally overheard this, ran into the room, and in his despair could not utter a word, could only stamp and make a strange bellowing sound, as though he had lost the power of speech. And Tanya, looking at her father, had uttered a heart-rending shriek, and had fallen into a swoon. It was hideous. All this came back into his memory as he looked at the familiar writing. Kovrin went out onto the balcony. It was still warm weather, and there was a smell of the sea. The wonderful bay reflected the moonshine and the lights, and was of a color for which it was difficult to find a name. It was a soft and tender blending of dark blue and green. In places, the water was like blue vitriol, and in places it seemed as though the moonlight were liquefied and filling the bay instead of water. And what harmony of colors! What an atmosphere of peace, calm, and sublimity. In the lower story under the balcony, the windows were probably open, for women's voices and laughter could be heard distinctly. Apparently there was an evening party. Kovrin made an effort, tore open the envelope, and going back into his room, read, My father is just dead. I owe that to you, for you have killed him. Our garden is being ruined. Strangers are managing it already. That is, the very thing is happening that poor father dreaded. That, too, I owe to you. I hate you with my whole soul, and I hope you may soon perish. Oh, how wretched I am! Insufferable anguish is burning my soul. My curse is on you. I took you for an extraordinary man, a genius. I loved you, and you have turned out a madman. Kovrin could read no more. He tore up the letter and threw it away. He was overcome by an uneasiness that was akin to terror. Varvara Nikolaevna was asleep behind the screen, and he could hear her breathing. From the lower story came the sounds of laughter and women's voices, but he felt as though in the whole hotel were no living soul but him. Because Tanya, unhappy, broken by sorrow, had cursed him in her letter and hoped for his perdition. He felt eerie and kept glancing hurriedly at the door, as though
He were afraid that the uncomprehended force, which 2 years before had wrought such havoc in his life and in the life of those near him, might come into the room and master him once more. He knew by experience that when his nerves were out of hand, the best thing for him to do was to work. He must sit down to the table and force himself at all costs to concentrate his mind on some one thought. He took from his red portfolio a manuscript containing a sketch of a small work of the nature of a compilation, which he had planned in case he should find it dull in the Crimea without work. He sat down to the table and began working at this plan, and it seemed to him that his calm, peaceful, indifferent mood was coming back. The manuscript with the sketch even led him to meditation on the vanity of the world. He thought how much life exacts for the worthless or very commonplace blessings it can give a man. For instance, to gain, before 40, a university chair, to be an ordinary professor, to expound ordinary and second-hand thoughts in dull, heavy, insipid language. In fact, to gain the position of a mediocre learned man, he, Kovrin, had had to study for 15 years, to work day and night, to endure a terrible mental illness, to experience an unhappy marriage, and to do a great number of stupid and unjust things which it would have been pleasant not to remember. Kovrin recognized clearly now that he was a mediocrity, and readily resigned himself to it, as he considered that every man ought to be satisfied with what he is. The plan of the volume would have soothed him completely, but the torn letter showed white on the floor and prevented him from concentrating his attention. He got up from the table, picked up the pieces of the letter, and threw them out of window. But there was a light wind blowing from the sea, and the bits of paper were scattered on the window-sill. Again, he was overcome by uneasiness akin to terror, and he felt as though in the whole hotel there were no living soul but himself. He went out on the balcony. The bay, like a living thing, looked at him with its multitude of light blue, dark blue, turquoise, and fiery eyes, and seemed beckoning to him. And it really was hot and oppressive, and it would not have been amiss to have a bathe. Suddenly in the lower story, under the balcony, a violin began playing, and 2 soft feminine voices began singing. It was something familiar. The song was about a maiden, full of sick fancies, who heard one night in her garden mysterious sounds, so strange and lovely that she was obliged to recognize them as a holy harmony, which is unintelligible to us mortals, and so flies back to heaven. Kovrin caught his breath, and there was a pang of sadness in his heart, and a thrill of the sweet, exquisite delight he had so long forgotten began to stir in his breast. A tall, black column, like a whirlwind or a waterspout, appeared on the further side of the bay. It moved with fearful rapidity across the bay, towards the hotel, growing smaller and darker as it came, and Kovrin only just had time to get out of the way to let it pass. The monk with bare grey head, black eyebrows, barefoot, his arms crossed over his breast, floated by him, and stood still in the middle of the room.
"Why did you not believe me?" he asked reproachfully, looking affectionately at Kovrin. "If you had believed me then, that you were a genius, you would not have spent these 2 years so gloomily and so wretchedly."
Kovrin already believed that he was one of God's chosen and a genius. He vividly recalled his conversations with the monk in the past and tried to speak, but the blood flowed from his throat onto his breast, and not knowing what he was doing, he passed his hands over his breast, and his cuffs were soaked with blood. He tried to call Varvara Nikolaevna, who was asleep behind the screen. He made an effort and said, "Tanya." He fell on the floor, propping himself on his arms. Called again.
Tanya.
He called Tanya. Called to the great garden with the gorgeous flowers sprinkled with dew. Called to the park, the pines with their shaggy roots, the rye field, his marvelous learning, his youth, courage, joy. Called to life, which was so lovely. He saw on the floor near his face a great pool of blood, and was too weak to utter a word. But an unspeakable, infinite happiness flooded his whole being. Below, under the balcony, they were playing a serenade, and the black monk whispered to him that he was a genius, and that he was dying only because his frail human body had lost its balance and could no longer serve as the mortal garb of genius. When Varvara Nikolaevna woke up and came out from behind the screen, Kovrin was dead, and a blissful smile was set upon his face. This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of The Black Monk, Part 2 of 2 by Anton Chekhov. Be sure to take advantage of our limited time offer and get a giftable all-access library pass and grant unlimited access to the Classic Tales audiobook library to your entire gift list this holiday season. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper. Part of the Airwave Podcasting Network.